Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching This All DC, and I absolutely love three-player Warcry, and it's something we don't get to do often enough. The core book only has 2 three-player games, and one of them you can really only play once. The King of the Hill game, I think it was fun the first time I played it, and then it loses its replayability very fast. The other one, the Last Leader Standing one that's in the core book, is reasonably fun, but you get to some problems where it really only works if every player agrees to play as if they've been concussed for the first round and a half. And then after that, you can actually try to make smart, interesting decisions. So I am very excited to announce that I have made a full tournament pack for 3-player games. And I'm really excited to share them with you. 3-player games are really fun, both because, sometimes that's how many friends you've got nearby, and it's great to have all 3 players playing instead of forcing one person to just sit and watch. And it's also fun because it adds some extra layers to Warcry. You get the dynamic of how you can't win if you just go 1 against 2. All of these kind of multiplayer situations is true of other 1v1 games that can be put into multiplayer. There is a new skill that develops and becomes really important, which is understanding who is winning. So I actually even think that 3-player games can help you practice for 1v1 because you really start to need to keep track of how many points are available to be scored on the board. Whereas in 1v1, this is a skill that will help you quite a bit, but it doesn't necessarily force you to practice that skill because you can just focus on just trying to beat your opponent's warband. So a lot to really love about 3-player game. This pack, it's designed for casual play. Most of the missions are pretty balanced, so that if you did want to do competitive play with it, it's doable as much as it's possible for 3-player gaming to be. For doing this pack, you can either roll D3 for these things or just select bespoke experiences, curated experiences as you wish. I'm going to get into the deployments. I did not write these deployments. I did not make them. Shout out to Matt in our local scene, also known as Logger on Discord. They did incredible work here, just translating what was a very old set of deployments that someone posted on the TGA forums, did a great job with their search engine optimization. I've never heard of this person, had not been playing Warcry yet when they posted them. This is in the very early days of 1.0 that they must have done this. And it was all with angles and protractors and arrows from the center line. Matt was able to kind of standardize this in the current parlance of our times, and it's really cool. So this deployment gives each player sort of a blob on the field that they are in control of. Each blob ends up being about the same size, but is a very different shape. You'll notice in general that 3 players on a square board, the board doesn't necessarily fit to make everything symmetrical, and so it takes a lot of work to make things balanced, and these really are, which I really like. So the other 2 deployments are more sort of cross-way things, sort of think of a 6-pointed star, and they're slightly different from each other. Both of them have 1 player who's essentially strung around the middle line of the field, but where the sort of other 2 players aren't just sort of on either side ganging up on them necessarily. The other players are closer to each other so that each player is sort of equidistant from each other, even though, 1 player is sort of along the line. You could also draw a line of pink players, fighters, and it would be a line with these 2 in between. So the difference between these 2 deployments is what the ambush deployment is doing. I really like deployments in general that have 1 ambush group and then 2 groups that are next to each other. So here you have your daggers, and then your little shield comes on an ambush, and your hammer has a lot of, let's say, flexibility in terms of reinforcing your dagger. You can come on the entire area, whereas your shield is going to only have a little bit of area that it can sort of scare your opponent from. The other ones, the opposite is true, where your shield is coming on in reinforcement and is very limited in where it can be, and then your dagger comes on with a huge amount of area where it can ambush too. these sort of play out a little bit differently. Once you've played them a few times, you'll notice that there are some differences to how they feel, but it's a very similar sort of, you have your safe area at the beginning, and then you have your ambush zone later on that you can use to really disrupt your opponent. Let's get into victory conditions. These come from playing a lot. We play this a lot locally, and there are 3 that we've been playing a lot. One is the Kill the Leader mission, one is an objective mission, and one is a treasure mission. And so these have been kind of iterated from those. Arcane Might was iterated from the Kill the Leader mission. The problem with the Kill the Leader mission is that it really only works if the players essentially agree to play badly in the first round, and so this fixes that by just creating incentives. That way you could actually run a tournament with this. Place a well of arcane energy in the center of the battlefield. Each player designates one of their fighters to be an arcane conduit. So I made it so it doesn't have to be your leader. Arcane conduits within 6 inches of the well of arcane energy can use an action to collect arcane power. Doing so scores 1 victory point. If a player's arcane conduit fighter is taken down, the player who took that fighter down scores 3 victory points. If that fighter is taken down through a fall, or you manage to kill it yourself, each of your opponents get 1. So some interesting play there in terms of denying people the full 3 and just giving 1 each to both of your fighters if your conduit is about to die. The battle ends after 4 rounds or once all 3 arcane conduits are taken down. So the biggest way to win this game is to take down both your opponent's arcane conduits. But there is sort of a secondary scoring mechanism that incentivizes you to walk towards the middle. 6 inches from the center is close enough that you can hide a little, far enough that you can hide a little bit, but close enough that you are always going to be reachable by enterprising opponents. So I like that. I like the kind of, there's incentives here to put your arcane conduit in a reinforcement group so that it's just not vulnerable right away. But then you could lose to your opponents seeing that you're doing that and then just aggressively spamming collect arcane power, and you essentially being way behind on doing that because they could get to the center in 1 move, get 1 point in round 1, and then even in round 2, you have to spend 2 moves to get there because you're coming from the far side, and they are just double arcane powering. So you start 3 behind, and all of a sudden you really need to kill both of their arcane conduits. So I think the incentives are pretty strong for putting your conduit on there in the first round, which gets people in each other's faces and fighting right away. Let's talk about Shifting Swamp. Shifting Swamp, you place 1 objective in the center of the battlefield, then you divide the battlefield into quarters and place 1 in the center of each quarters. For if your game board is 30 by 22, that'll be 7.5 by 5.5 is the center of each quarter. Most boards are actually 30 by 22.5, so it'll be 7.5 by 5 3/4. The player who wins initiative in round 1 designates one of the outside objectives, so you've got the center and the 4 outside, one of the outside objectives to be the primary objective for round 1. Then the remaining players roll off and the winner chooses clockwise or counterclockwise, and then each round you will rotate 1 quarter in that chosen direction. This was created by Cody, and thanks to, I worry about pronouncing the name wrong, but Mache, for playtesting it. One thing he noticed is that this one is a little bit punishing to slower warbands and warbands that are entirely move 4 fighters. I did mess around with that in twists so that you can have a twist that'll change that a little bit. But the idea here is there are 2 objectives that are 11 inches apart, and so if you look at the 3-inch grace area for that, there's 5 inches of sort of no scoring land in between, and so you'll have to find a way to cross that gap. And for the other one, there's 11 inches of no scoring, 9 inches of no scoring area in between, and so that's a long gap to cross in just 1 round. So you are going to need to think ahead in terms of where you put your fighters to count on the primary. Also note that the primary starts having kill scores. So if you take a fighter down using a melee attack action on the primary objective, you score a point. So that sort of gives catch-up mechanics for the person who is sort of got the more elite warband. The other thing here is this will sort of incentivize each of the players to have a certain time in the game when they are fighting each other given player, right? So if you look at these objectives, you'll have different people differently equipped to fight over each sort of outside objective depending on when it is, but that'll sort of create different important fights across the board, which is good. So it kind of incentivizes you to interact with each other player in a different manner depending on when the round is. Into Killer's Cross, I've played a lot of No Quarter sort of mashups. No Quarter is a mission from the core book that is really fun but annoying because it ends in draws about 50% of the time, maybe even more. And every single time I see someone brew a difference to No Quarter, it's always really fun because the core of No Quarter is great. It's just the problem is that it's a draw every time. So this is another one, very similar to every other. Divide the battlefield into quarters. At the end of each battle round, you score 1 point for each of the following. You get one for each quarter in which you have at least one friendly fighter. Each quarter in which a friendly fighter took down an enemy fighter with an attack action. So you have to be standing within the quarter, but they can be... The target could be straddling, the target could be in a different quarter or something like that, and it's fine. And then each quarter in which you have the most friendly fighters wholly within the quarter than any other player. So there's a lot of different ways to score this. If you are a very killy warband, you can score just as easily as if you have a very numerous warband, which I really like. And then there's also just this idea that in a 2-player quarters scenario, you generally have 1 quarter that you are sort of have a really good chance of controlling, 1 quarter that is really hard for you to control, and then 2 quarters that are very contested tightly between the 2 players. The dynamic in this, where you have 3 players and everyone is sort of set up in that situation, is very different, and it's going to behoove people to try to think ahead about which dynamics are going to play out in other quarters on the board and sort of move their players around differently. There's going to be a very interesting thing where in these cross deployments, each player could potentially fight over every quarter, but you'll see like here, blue is going to have a hard time getting to these 2 quarters, but it's going to have a really great time in these 2. But red could fight over every quarter starting in round 2, but would be overextended in each situation, right? Things like that. So one thing I've noticed is that the game does play out very differently if you're one of these 2 side people versus whether you're strung on the middle. And that's okay because it still feels pretty balanced, but it feels asymmetrical, which is a really fun dynamic to have. I really love those deployments. Let's get into Rat Race. Rat Race, you place a treasure chest on the center of the battlefield, and then players roll off. They each place a treasure chest. It has to be more than 9 inches from the center of the battlefield. This is trying to get you to use the whole board, and at least 5 inches from any other treasure chest. Any fighter within 1 inch of a treasure chest token that their controller did not place can spend an action to loot it. So you don't have to only rush to the center. You can rush to other people's treasure chests. You can do things like go try to take out a fighter who's almost ready to deposit their treasure. So whenever a fighter carrying treasure finishes a move action within 1 inch of the treasure chest that their controller placed, they deposit the treasure and score 4 points. So you are running to a treasure chest, taking the treasure out, and then running back home and putting it in your own treasure chest. But there's interesting dynamics here where, let's say you've got drawn out into another player's treasure chest because you wanted to stop them from scoring. You wanted to kill the fighter before it did that. Now you're really close to their treasure chest. You can actually loot that one and run back home. Things like that to just improve the 3-player interaction of the scenario. And so let's get into finally contested territory, or not quite finally. Contested territory, before the battle, players roll off, place 1 objective at the center of the battlefield, then starting with the player with the highest roll, each puts 1 more objective. They have to be more than 4 inches from the edge and 6 from any other objective. This is one that Matt standardized a long time ago, and we have been playing it for over a year at this point. It is just very simple and very fun, just very replayable. It works every time. It does, of course, benefit hordes more than any other. I would say, Shifting Swamp benefits hordes quite a bit, but Contested Territory even more so. But those are really the only two. Killer's Cross numbers are important, but they're not that important. And then, of course, Rat Race. Sure, you want to have a lot of people who can run around, but at the end of the day, killing power and staying power and movement are the most important things. That's true of Arcane Might as well. So there's sort of a lot of different, I'll just say, real work went into making sure that different types of warbands could have things to be their strengths and weaknesses in different scenarios here. And Contested Territory is very simple. It's a very straightforward objective mission, but I was really feeling like it was important to include something very simple in this pack because 3-player games are already a big wrinkle, and so just giving something simple for people to drag on or grab onto is important, right? The last one is Overwhelming Greed, which is like Contested Territory. People place treasures, same 4 horizontally, 6 horizontally from other treasures. But then in round 3, they roll off, they do it again, but now it has to be 4 from the edge and 2 from each other treasure token. The 2 inches instead of 6 is just because the board is going to start to get crowded at that point. The thing I like about this, so we have been playing a very similar mission where it's just the first paragraph of this scenario, and that mission is pretty fun. The only issue is that sometimes it devolves into a very stable state where there's 3 fights that matter, and whoever wins 2 of those fights is going to win the game kind of regardless of what happens. And so you just kind of, sometimes you spend the last couple rounds just kind of sitting and waiting for these fights to play out. You have a pretty good sense of how they'll play out, but if someone rolls weird, then it could change, and so you're just kind of resolving your original ideas. So this forces you to sort of adjust your strategy in the mid game. The beginning of round 3 kind of gets to change everything here and allow people to kind of mess with each other a little bit, which I really like. And sort of the central dynamic of Contested Territory and Overwhelming Greed that has worked so often for our play group is just the fact that 4 objectives doesn't divide into 3. Overwhelming Greed, 7 and 4 for treasures don't divide into 3, and so that it builds sort of contested gameplay just through the very basic numbers of it, which is going to be fun. So let's get into some twists real quick. Desperate Inspiration, if you are losing or tied for the loss, you get to roll 7 initiative dice instead of the usual 6. I've adjusted it so that you can determine who is winning for the 2 treasure missions that don't score until the end for the most part as well. But having 7 initiative dice is an idea that came from some twists very early in the game, but most people didn't really play with it much until overthinkingwarcry.com gave it as one of their main twists in their battle pack. And it's pretty cool because you'll notice when you roll 7 instead of rolling 6 that it feels different than just having an extra wild dice because you roll crazier numbers more often, and then your regular wild dice can be used better. So you're much more likely to have a rampage, things like that. It's even possible to roll 2 triples, which is essentially unheard of in regular Warcry rolls. So that can be kind of cool, and it is a big enough advantage to be a real catch-up mechanic without being like completely over the top. Frenetic Energy is before the combat phase of round 1. The players roll off, starting with the highest roll. They get one of their fighters is going to have half of the wounds, but plus 3 movement. So this is going to let you get around the board. This is created so that if people want to do this on some of the ones that really reward speed, like Rat Race really rewards speed and Shifting Swamp really rewards speed, you have a twist that can sort of even that playing field out if you want to, or you can force your players to plan out their warbands to have speed, right? So you can kind of do it either way using this twist. And otherwise, there's kind of a lot of interesting ways that you can try to use to your benefit, one of your fighters being extremely fragile but very, very fast. And it's not going to completely change the game. Everything else about the game is the same. There's just this one fighter who's very different. big game hunters, whenever a fighter makes a melee attack action, note the wounds characteristic of the target fighter. If the target fighter has a higher wounds characteristic than the attacking fighter, +2 strength. So now little strength 3 fighters can be hitting on 4s against a pretty tough T5 fighter. I like this because it just gives a way for hordes to actually take down the big, huge things, which is sometimes an impossible task depending on the mission. There's also a sort of mission that is on the opposite, or a twist that's on the opposite, called Deadly Splatter. Whenever a fighter takes down an enemy fighter using a melee attack action, you may deal 1 damage to an additional enemy fighter within 1 inch. When I publish this, it'll be more clear that it's an inch from the fighter you took down, because it's the shrapnel, the splatter from when you took them out is starting to hurt their friends, right? And then if you get a crit while taking down an enemy fighter, you get to deal D3 to an additional enemy fighter within 3 inches. So this is just there because sometimes when you have an elite warband and you're trying to catch up on numbers, sometimes you just, like, leaving a fighter on 1 can just be an absolute disaster for you. Like, let's say you have a big chunker who is able to take out the opponent's chaff in 1 hit about 50% of the time. And when you fail, you almost always leave them on 1 or 2, and it's just a disaster for you. This way, you can jump down to where you can attack 2 fighters. You're hoping to take them each out in 1 hit, but when you miss 1, it's like you have this awful sort of decision you have to make of, do I finish off the one that I didn't quite kill, or do I try to one-shot the other one? And this gives you sort of more incentive to, if you leave something on 1 wound, you get to try with the other one, and if it works, then you get double. So you get to kind of go double or nothing if you want to, which gives just a little bit more tools for the elite warbands to take out the hordes a little bit quickly. So you can have 1 twist that helps hordes take out elites, and 1 twist that helps elites take out hordes, and that can be used judiciously by a TO to kind of balance things out how they want to. Epic encounters, add 1 to crit damage for attack actions in which a hero targets a hero, ally, or monster. And then whenever a hero is taken down, it gets a parting shot. If it does, it deals D6 to an enemy fighter within 3 inches. This is just to make crazy talk about moments. It's a subtle push. I don't like when twists completely change the game, but it is a push towards overextending with your leader and being punished less for doing so. It gives you the opportunity to get huge crit situations, and if you do overextend and get taken down, you at least get a little bit of a prize for doing so in that D6. So I think that that's just sort of a small, subtle difference that can be pretty fun. Finally, we have the People's Champion. It's the other catch-up mechanic. So we've got Desperate Inspiration as 1 catch-up, and this one as another one. Before each battle round, the player who is losing in the current battle round gets to designate the People's Champion. There's only 1 People's Champion at a time. Whenever the People's Champ makes a melee attack action, if the target of that attack action was not taken down, they may apply the People's Elbow. If they do, they deal an additional D3. This is a destruction narrative artifact, Dynasty Shiv, that this is taken from. It's a fun artifact that's just not as powerful as the other artifacts in the game, and so that's why it doesn't really get taken, but it is a really fun one in that you can get this kind of consolation prize. It's a little bit like having +1 attack, but where that attack always hits but doesn't do a lot of damage, which I think is a good place for this to be. It's a small catch-up mechanic that actually has a lot of multiplayer sort of play to it. You could actually give one of your opponents the People's Champion in return for an agreement that they only attack the other opponent, something like that, or just knowing that they have to attack the other opponent because they're already in combat with the other opponent, or you can just put it on your own and try to just do as much work as you can while you can. So you kind of get a lot of judgment that you can make in terms of how you apply the People's Champion. Finally, just some notes on tournament structure. In general, locally, we play 800 points instead of 1,000. You can play 1,000, but the games will take a very long time if you do so. So 800 reduces it more. Why 800 instead of 700? The board starts to be a little sparse. 700 would be 2100 points, which is close to the 2000 that is a 1v1 game. But your ability to actually do interesting things with your warband really decreases a lot for each 100 points in a way that 900 points doesn't feel that different from 1,000. The jump down to 800 feels bigger than the jump from 1,000 to 9. The jump down to 700 feels bigger than the jump down from, it's just how much percentage are you going down each time, right? And at 700 points, it gets really, really difficult to fit certain things in your warband. And I want people to be able to play what feels like whole warbands, but just smaller and more compact to fit 3 players into the same board. Consider having 2 TOs. That way it's easier to answer questions and you'll have a remainder of 2. So no matter what, you can get a multiple of 3. Obviously, there are fewer multiples of 3 than there are of 2. So you do, as the TO, need to think about how you're going to correct this. Another way to do it is just to have, instead of a bye like would be in a 1v1 tournament where whoever is in last place just automatically gets a win, you could have a bye where the 2 people at the bottom just play a 2-player game and there is no last place. There's just the 2 players getting, first place and second place. And so that's sort of like a third of a bye for each of the 2 players, something like that. And that can work well for those situations. But you will want to have your TO make sure that you never end up with an odd number that is not divisible by 3. So we're looking at 7 or 11 or 17, things like that can be very 13. I think those numbers can be really difficult to play a 3-player tournament with. So you'll want to just make it so your TO either quits to stop you from having 13 or joins to make it so that you get up to 14 so that you can have 3 3-player games and 1 2, something like that. Give people 90 to 100 minutes per round. 3-player games just take a little bit longer. There's a little bit more to think about because you have to sort of think about the sort of geopolitical situation on the board as well as just your matchup with each player. So there's just a little more to think about, which is why rounds take a tiny bit longer. Plan to play 3 rounds because of that instead of 4. And don't worry that you're not sort of churning through the standings quickly because 3-player games differentiate players exponentially quicker than 2-player games do. So 3 rounds of 1v1 turns a field of 8 players to 1 champion. 3 rounds of 1v1v1 turns a field of 27 players to 1 champion. So you get a lot more stratification a lot more quickly with 3-player games. So you will really feel, even with a very big tournament, you will feel after 3 rounds like you've done the whole thing. The next bullet point is just good in general. Always let your opponent players know if you're going to roll or if you're going to curate a specific experience. And then you can do Swiss pairings determined by one of the 2 scoring methods below. I wanted to talk about them. One of them, I'll talk about the second one first. This one's much more similar to how we score in 1v1 tournaments, where each 3-player game can essentially be described in 4 ways in the outcome. You either get a normal game, a high tie, a low tie, or a 3-way. 12 is the magic number where you can describe the 4 permutations with 3 players in a way that the same number of points are being assigned no matter what the permutation, right? So first, second, third be 6-4-2, but then in a high tie it's 5-5-2, in a low tie it's 6-3-3, and in a 3-way it's 4 for everybody. It's very simple, very regimented. The only thing here is it does homogenize standings a little bit, and it doesn't give as much of a description of what really happened in the event, but it is very easy to use and very concrete, and probably will work for a lot of people. Another way to do it is victory point conversion. This kind of rewards you a lot more for dominant performances. It does a better job, I think, reflecting what actually happened in a tournament. And it also encourages kind of risky point maximizing plays, which isn't necessarily something you want to encourage in a 1v1 tournament. You want to let people approach however they want. But in a 3-player tournament, maybe make it more casual. And this does that a little bit. So here you just take what the average score is. So if the Stark kids played and it was 22 to 14 to 17, and then the Lannister kids played and it was 19 to 21 to 11, you average all those out, it gets to 17 and a third, and then you divide by the average score. So now Bran is winning at 1.27, Cersei's in second at 1.21, Jaime's in third at 1.1, and then Arya's fourth, Sansa's fifth, and Tyrion is last. This is season 7 Tyrion, not season 2 Tyrion. Season 2 Tyrion obviously would be winning everything here, but season 7 Tyrion doesn't know what he's doing. Now, the next match essentially would be Jaime, Cersei, and Bran, and then Sansa, Arya, and Tyrion would play, because that would be the Swiss pairings based on who has the highest scores at that point. So that's everything with this pack. I hope people try it out. I hope people are already playing 3-player, but it's really fun because it's really fun. But I totally get if you're not, because it is just not really supported in the core book. And I think that's really a shame. I think it should be supported more. I think it's a very fun way to play the game. And it's a way that you can actually, it doesn't have to be just beer and pretzels, meaningless games. You can actually build warbands to maximize your chances of winning these scenarios. You can actually think competitively in these scenarios, which I really like. And so that was a big part of my motivation for creating this, and something that I hope people try. I will be back with more sort of traditional Warcry content in the future, but until then, may all your rolls be crits.